Okay, so thank you, Pascal. So as you said, I am Anique Atherley. I originally had some medical training and went into public health, and now I am in medical education. I'm actually a joint PhD candidate, a jointure between Maastricht University and Western Sydney University, the latter of whom actually funds the PhD scholarship that I have. So who's Anique? Most of my friends and family call me Neeks. They always say that I'm a giver of advice, and I'm the eldest of three girls, the shortest as well. A little bit more about me. I like to see places. So last year I had a wonderful trip in the US, and those are a couple pictures of the places that I've been. I like positivity. So you'll see quotes on a lot of things that I do. And the last quote there is actually from my personal mentor back home. And I like porpoises, also known as dolphins. So on to the serious stuff. So my PhD topic is called Social Relationships and the Transition to Clinical Training. A little bit about the research team. So I actually have 4 supervisors because of the setup of my PhD. So there's me coming from Barbados, which if you don't know, it's in the Caribbean region over by the Americas. 7,000 kilometers away where I am currently situated. We're in the Netherlands, where I am daily supervised by Professor Deanna Dolmans and Pim Turnison. Then 16 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers away from that, in Australia, where I'll go next year, I have Dr. Iman Higassi and Professor Wendy Hugh, who will be supervising me there. So on to my outline. So she presents me and I present to you my research. I'm going to give you some introduction with a background, my problem, gap, and hook, introduce you to my sensitizing concepts, and then state my research questions. So a bit of background. In a 5-year medical program, I know medical schools are different, but if you take a 5-year medical program, for example, medical students will spend the first part of their training in the classroom primarily. Even though increasingly they are bringing some clinical aspects to the preclinical area, the primary place of the classroom is in the classroom. And then they switch to clinical training, and that's a transition period for them where they then have to adjust to a new learning environment. Once they finish medical school, they transition again into now actually practicing on patients, supervised practice for the very first time. In a 6-year medical program like we have here, that transition takes place after 3 years, and then they have another 3 years before they then are transitioned again. So what's the problem? So no matter what the medical school structure is, transitions are inevitable. They're going to happen, but they can be associated with poor outcomes, even though they have the ability to actually have positive developmental outcomes. So some of the poorer outcomes would be poorer well-being, such as anxiety and stress, which then lead on to suboptimal learning habits, and learning is then compromised. The gap is that research has not yet explored how relationships with others in the learning environment could actually impact on students' transition experiences. And if we can better understand that transition to clinical training, we could perhaps minimize the threats and teach them how to use relationships with others to have a smoother transition experience and better learning. So my sensitizing concepts: communities of practice, described by Lab and Wegner, which describes a group of people working together towards a common purpose. For example, a group of health professionals working together towards patient care. When our medical students then enter that environment, they often feel like outsiders. So there's what Lab and Wegner call this boundary that exists as the students then try to integrate, to move towards the center of that community and actually participate legitimately. Boundary objects could be people that actively try to introduce the students to the new environment, or objects like handbooks as well. The next concept is organizational socialization theory, which has these tenets that they say could lead to positive transition outcomes for any newcomer to a new environment. So for example, being positive, having resilient qualities lead to better outcomes such as performance and developmental, professional and personal development. Behaviors such as actually seeking feedback and the ability to develop relationships actually has positive outcomes. And organizational efforts represent where an institution actively has socialization tactics. So they actually try to involve newcomers into their new environment. They have formal orientations to the new environment. Newcomer adjustment represents when the newcomers' roles are actively clarified and there's persistent guidance, and those again have better outcomes. So I'm actually performing this research from a social constructionism stance, which states that which emphasizes interactions between people and how that reality is constructed. So onto my research question. So the overarching research question is how do relationships between students starting clinical training and others in the clinical environment influence their transition to clinical training? How do those relationships influence that transition? So the first question is, how do we support students currently making the transition to undergraduate clinical training? Next one states which relationships between new clinical students and others in the clinical environment actually influence their transition to clinical training. Relating to informal knowledge, between new clinical students, what aspects are shared, when are they shared, and why are they actually shared between students? And how do boundary objects relevant to the clinical community of practice hinder or enhance relationships between new clinical students? In terms of my methods, primarily qualitative. So for the first one, I'm going to be doing a scoping review. For the second one, we are between discussing ethnography versus audio diaries. The third one, individual interviews, and the last one, ethnography as well. So the first one is obviously the one that we have more developed. So that's going to be a scoping review answering this question: how do we support students making the transition to undergraduate clinical training? Those are the databases that we will search using these search terms and their synonyms: transitions, clerkship, and medical. And I want to do a qualitative synthesis of the articles that we do choose, looking and analyze them looking through the lens of organizational socialization to structure that. So in summary, my topic is social relationships and the transition to clinical training. It's going to be a qualitative program of research, and I hope to learn and gain a lot, contribute to the medical literature, and have fun. And yeah, that's it for me.